Hello there and welcome to Black Jackal Gaming. Today we're going to take a look at the first company task force, which is the Veteran Detachment in the Space Marine Codex. Now this detachment focuses on all the veteran units. The detachment rule is very meh. The stratagems are a little bit too niche to be that good. It needs a big rework by Games Workshop. Well, let's take a look at it. So the detachment rule is once per battle in your command phase, you can use this ability. If you do until the start of the command phase, each time a model from your army with the Alpha Moment ability makes an attack that targets your Alpha Moment target, reroll the wound roll. That means once per game, your Alpha Moment target is reroll hit, +1 to wound, and reroll wounds, which isn't too bad, but being once a game isn't the strongest of detachment rules. Looking at the enhancements, you've got Imperium Sword. This gives the bearer +1 attacks in melee, and once a game you can get +1 attacks for the bearer's unit. It's quite repeated for most of the enhancements. Fear Made Manifest, this is an aura. Enemy units within 6 inches, if they fail a battle shock test, one model is destroyed, and once per game you can do D3 destroyed models. Rights of War is Terminator model only. You get to improve the OC by 1 for the character, and once per game OC by 1 for the entire unit. Finally, Iron Resolve, Terminator only again. It gives the bearer the Funeral Pain 5+, and once again, once per game, you get the Funeral Pain 5+ for the entire unit. As you can see, a little bit on the weak side. On paper, they look okay, but it's the once per game bonus, which isn't the strongest. Once you take this into account, spending quite a lot of money for +1 OC on a Terminator isn't really the way you want to go. Now have a quick run through from the strats. You got one that gives you +1 to hit, and if below half strength, +1 to wound. One in your opponent's command phase. You can make each enemy unit within 6 inches take a battle shock test, and this will be a -1 if they're below half strength. This will override any of the battle shock tests they have to take, so you can't stack them. You get one that gives you a sticky objective, one that puts your Terminator unit back into strategic reserve, so you can deep strike again. One that gives you a -1 to damage after being charged, so quite niche. And of course you do have Armor Contempt as well. So all the stratagems are only for the veteran units, and a couple of them you can only use on the Terminator units as well. So it makes it quite difficult to get the most out of an army when you're down to a couple of data sheets. So why is the detachment so bad? Well, the units being buffed aren't the strongest, because you are focusing mostly on Blade Guard, Terminator Stern Guard, and they've all received at least 1 points drop so far. We do have the Vanguard Veterans as well. They haven't been given a points drop, and they are a little bit on the pricey side. Now you do have Gladius, which is essentially the Ultramarines detachment, and it's the one that seems to get all the buffs from Games Workshop. Now this detachment, you can get more out of the above named units just by using that detachment, because you're not locked into just having those units as well. You can buff all the other units you can take. Now these units, they just operate better in that detachment. There's better stratagems, there's a better detachment rule. Now even when you look at one of the stronger armies with this detachment, the Dark Angels, where you've got the upgraded Deathwing Knights and the Dark Angels Terminators, it still doesn't make a good detachment because they are just better used elsewhere. Now, if you put yourself in a position where you're buffing one type of unit, but this unit can be buffed to the same, if not better, in other detachments, and then you get to buff all the other units as well, it just puts you in a position where you've got a lot more flexibility just going elsewhere than being restricted to just these units that aren't doing that well on the tabletop anyway. Now, when you look at them, the enhancements are pretty expensive. And if you could use them the entire game, that would be good. But as soon as you've used up that one time a game, they are pretty meh, and they are slightly on the pricey side for what they do. You're also in a bit of a weird position where Stern Guard Veterans don't actually get buffed by the enhancements, because the +1 attack doesn't really do much when you Strength 4 0 AP. Even though you do have a fair few attacks coming in Stern Guard Veterans, they're not going to really do much better with that extra 1 attack. When you got the 2 stratagems locked by Terminators, and then the other one is in order to destroy a model a turn, really, if they fail a battle shock test, it's not really anything you can put on the Stern Guard Veterans. When you think of how well they can be buffed in Gladius as well as Librarius Conclave, it doesn't really make you want to lean into this unit in the detachment. And of course, 2 of the enhancements are completely locked to Terminators, which having 50% of your enhancements locked to one type of unit isn't really the most balanced way to build a detachment, really, that's meant to be focusing on all the veteran units. The stratagems are also incredibly weak. You've really only got one damage dealing stratagem. It doesn't really coincide with Oath of Mona because they haven't reworked the detachment at all to go with the new +1 to wound. It puts you in a strange position where you can't really deal that much damage with any of the enhancements or the stratagems using them together. It's just a bit strange, really. Now, you do have intercessors that are incredibly cheap, and they already come with a sticky objective, and they got that large strength 4 -1 AP damage output. So why would you pay a CP just to get sticky objectives on a more expensive unit? They put way too much emphasis on battle shock tests because this was the first codex out. They really wanted to utilize all of the core rules. So you do see instances where they lean too heavily on some of the core rules that in later codexes they don't touch at all, because they come to the understanding that battle shock doesn't really achieve much in the game. You don't that often fail battle shock. So units that lean heavily into this, they're not really seeing any action on the tabletop. Now, apart from the battle shock stratagem synchronizing with the enhancement, very little in the detachment actually synchronizes. You really want a detachment where the detachment rule leads into the enhancements, which then leads into the stratagems, so you can really buff key units. And this detachment just doesn't really offer that. So how can you go about improving it? There's quite a few options you can have, but really you want to give them the detachment rule for all turns. Having that reroll of wounds would be really nice, but that might be a little bit too powerful. So you would want to limit this just to the veteran units. I think it's a bit strange to keep listing all of the units on all the stratagems and enhancements you can use them for. So rather than doing this, in the detachment rule, they should just list all the units that counted as a veteran unit and give them the veteran keyword, and then use this keyword to lock the stratagems and the enhancements rather than listing all the units all the time. It just makes some of the stratagems quite wordy when it's really needless. Now, if they are considering the veteran units, they really should add the ancients to the list. They are the ancient for a reason. It's a veteran that is there holding the banner of the chapter, so he should be included. And company heroes really should be included in the list anyway. That really sets you up to have the veterans and the heroes of the chapter being represented in the one detachment. Now, to make it a little bit interesting, they could give the Blade Guard veterans and the Stern Guard veterans the battle line keyword. I know that Terminator suits are quite limited in chapters, so it probably wouldn't make much sense to get them battle line, but there's absolutely nothing to prevent you from making Blade Guard and Stern Guard battle line, and it'd make it a little bit more interesting with the decrease in points for Blade Guard veterans. Having multiple 3-man units on the tabletop could actually be really beneficial, rather than just being locked to the 3 of them. Now, they really need to look at the enhancements and make the buff happen to the entire unit. If not, they're going to have to decrease the points, really, because they're a bit too expensive. Now, I do understand if they did make it for the entire unit, it does make it much more powerful, so they probably would have to increase the price for a couple of the enhancements. Now, the one stratagem that does give you a little bit of a damage buff, the Heroes of the Chapter, that gives you the +1 to hit and then +1 to wound at a target that's below half strength. This doesn't really synchronize with the army rule anymore. You've already got an army-wide +1 to wound against your Oath of Mona target, and your Terminators get +1 to hit into that as well. So you're really putting your Terminators in a position where if they're going into your Oath of Mona target, the only damage increasing stratagem that you have will actually do absolutely nothing for the unit. So really, they should change this to something that's a little bit more universal and can be used across all of the units. It's pointless having a quarter of your buff units being unable to take the damage dealing stratagem. So they maybe should change this to something like sustained hits, just to make these units a little bit punchier in combat. Now, I would probably limit this to the melee attacks because they are mostly melee units. I know the Stone Guard veterans aren't a melee unit as such, but they do come with a lot of attacks, and the sustained hits would be quite good for them going into your toughness 3 bodies. The Battle Shock stratagem, they should just change that to make it -1 by default. I do quite like how it synchronizes with the enhancement, and being able to pop this in your opponent's command phase would be really nice. But it should just have the -1 by default. A lot of armies will, 9 times out of 10, pass their Battle Shock test. So you want to make it a little bit more worthwhile if you're spending a CP as well as points on an enhancement for it. The Terminators do have an ability that's a bit on the weak side. Again, it's a battle shock test, and it's a battle shock test on the charge. So they should possibly just make this an aura, which would be quite nice, because that again would synchronize with the enhancement and the stratagem. But if they didn't make it an aura, make it that it's in engagement range rather than just on the charge. And again, this should have a -1 to the battle shock test, which would be quite nice if this is stackable as well. So you can really push these armies that probably aren't expecting to fail a battle shock test, but when you get them in at -2, and if you have some Reavers in there as well, you might be able to push them towards a -3. It's going to make a lot of armies actually take notice at this unit. Now, this year's, it's been kind of a lost brother in, I'd say, 9th and 10th edition, really. When you look at it, it is a good model. It's got a decent data sheet, but just struggles to find a place. Could do with the buff of another character with it. You lose a lot by taking it. By example, if you've got the captain, it gives you the access to the cheaper stratagems, which you really want to be leaning into. Now, the fight first, you're often going to be charging with these units that you're going to put the Justiciar in anyway. So having that as the ability rather than a damage dealing ability or access to a cheaper stratagem puts it in a slightly odd place where you're just a little bit more efficient and flexible taking other options. So in conclusion, the first company has been neglected from the start of the edition. It's quite sad how out the gate you had a detachment that just didn't work, and they haven't revisited it at all. None of the data sheets have been touched, none of the enhancements, the stratagems, or the detachment rule. And when they updated Dove a moment, they had the opportunity to change it then, and they just chose not to. It's like they've just allowed this detachment to die, because as long as you're using Gladius, which they keep pushing, that seems to make them happy. They need to add some serious buffs to the detachment rule, enhancements, and stratagems to make it worthwhile. Now, you don't want it to be broken, it to be meta-defining, but you want to see, the odd person taking this to a tournament. You want to see it being used in casual play and in narrative play, because at the moment, there's very little reason to take this detachment at all. It is the weakest out of all the Space Marine detachments. It really won't take much for GW to make the detachment viable. We've gone over some minor changes to it, not even rewriting everything, just little updates to coincide with the rest of the edition and the changes to the Space Marine rules. You got the updates to the detachment rule, just a little tweak. The enhancements, again, a little tweak. Really, you only need to change one stratagem because the rest are okay if you take away the must be at half strength or below starting strength. If you get rid of those, they're not actually that bad, especially if you've got better enhancements and the detachment rule. Adding a couple of battle line keywords means that you can take more units. If you can only take these units 3 times, then you are really restricted of what you can take. Now, you don't really want to power up the detachment too much and it bump up other units like repulsors or something like that, or your ballistic dreadnought that's really doing well at the moment. You want it to be focusing on these veteran units because that's the whole point. So they should make them shine. These units should operate in this detachment better than any other detachment, but they just don't. And it's something that they really need to look at because they're all cool models. Even the Vanguard veterans, the Assault Terminators, not so much. They do need an updated kit. But it's just a shame to see such good models with a lot of history and some of them being really iconic, and they are meant to be the veterans of the chapters, and they're just really struggling to see any play on the tabletop, really. I'd be pretty surprised if this first company task force had been taken at all in the competitive play. Might have had the odd meme list in a small tournament, but it's so poor that there's really no reason to take it over Gladius if you just want a flexible detachment that pretty much does everything this does but lets you take more toys to the battle. If you like the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to see all future content. Take it easy, I'll see you next time.